A North Korean missile just did something it's never done before. It didn't land in the ocean. It didn't break apart on re-entry. It hit Japanese territory. The impact occurred at 0347 local time in a rural area of Hokkaido. No casualties. Minimal damage. But the strategic implications are catastrophic. Because Tokyo's response wasn't what anyone expected. Within 90 minutes, Japanese F-15J fighters were flying combat air patrols over the Sea of Japan. Japanese Aegis destroyers moved to forward positions. And the Japanese Prime Minister issued a statement that sent shockwaves through every capital from Washington to Beijing. Japan reserves the right to strike North Korean launch facilities preemptively. This is States News, where we break down the military and geopolitical events that reshape global power. We don't do surface-level analysis. We show you the strategic calculations that drive decisions in war rooms and intelligence agencies. If you want to understand what's really happening when nations move toward conflict, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, because what happened in the last 48 hours changes everything about Northeast Asian security. For 77 years, Japan has maintained a purely defensive military posture. The Japanese self-defense forces, despite being one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, have operated under constitutional constraints that prohibit offensive operations. This has been the foundation of regional stability. North Korea could launch missiles toward Japan, knowing that Tokyo's response would be limited to interception attempts and diplomatic protests. That assumption just collapsed. The missile impact on Japanese soil triggered something unprecedented, a political consensus in Tokyo that defensive measures are no longer sufficient. Japan is now openly discussing preemptive strike capabilities against North Korean missile sites. This represents the most significant shift in Japanese defense policy since World War II. It has profound implications for the U.S.-Japan alliance, for China's calculations about regional military balance, for South Korea's security environment, and for North Korea's regime survival calculus. The strategic stability that has prevented major war in Northeast Asia for decades is now in question. Let's establish what actually happened, because the details matter enormously. On May 12, 2026, at approximately 0320 local time, North Korea launched what appeared to be a Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile from the Sunan area near Pyongyang. This wasn't unusual. North Korea has conducted over 30 missile tests in the past 18 months. Japanese and South Korean radars tracked the launch immediately. The missile's trajectory was initially consistent with previous tests, a lofted path designed to demonstrate range capability without overflying Japanese territory. But something went wrong. At approximately 0342 local time during the terminal phase of flight, the missile's trajectory deviated. Whether this was a malfunction, deliberate targeting, or atmospheric factors is still under investigation. What's certain is that the missile's debris field, including sections of the warhead assembly, impacted Japanese territory in a sparsely populated area of Hokkaido, approximately 40 kilometers from the city of Wakkanai. Japanese self-defense force units secured the impact site within 30 minutes. Initial radiation surveys were negative, confirming no nuclear material was aboard. Conventional explosive residue was detected, but there was no detonation. The physical damage was minimal. The debris scattered across agricultural land. One barn was destroyed. No injuries were reported. But the political damage was immediate and massive. For the first time since World War II, North Korean military hardware had struck Japanese sovereign territory. The psychological impact on the Japanese public was profound. Citizens had grown accustomed to air raid warnings and shelter-in-place alerts during North Korean launches. They had trusted that Japan's multi-layered missile defense system would protect them. That trust was shaken. Within hours, public opinion polling showed 73% of Japanese citizens supporting a more aggressive response posture toward North Korea. Now let's understand Japan's strategic position before this incident. Japan's post-war constitution, specifically Article 9, renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of military forces with war potential. In practice, Japan has interpreted this to allow self-defense forces, but has maintained strict limitations on offensive capability. Japan doesn't possess long-range strike weapons. Japanese defense planning has focused on interception, Patriot PAC-3 batteries for terminal phase defense, Aegis destroyers with SM-3 interceptors for mid-course interception, and early warning radars to provide maximum reaction time. This defensive posture has been reinforced by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Under this alliance, the United States guarantees Japan's security and provides extended nuclear deterrence, often called the nuclear umbrella. In exchange, Japan hosts approximately 54,000 U.S. military personnel at bases across the country, including major installations in Okinawa, Yokosuka, and Misawa. The implicit bargain has been clear. Japan doesn't need offensive military capabilities because American power provides both deterrence and, if necessary, retaliation against any aggressor. But this arrangement has become increasingly strained. North Korea's missile and nuclear programs have advanced dramatically over the past decade. Pyongyang now possesses an estimated 30 to 60 nuclear warheads and delivery systems capable of reaching any target in Japan within minutes. More importantly, North Korea has demonstrated technologies that complicate missile defense: maneuverable re-entry vehicles, decoys, depressed trajectories that reduce warning time, and hypersonic glide vehicles that are extremely difficult to intercept. Japan's missile defense architecture, sophisticated as it is, cannot guarantee interception of all incoming missiles in a saturation attack. If North Korea launched 10 missiles simultaneously, Japanese and American systems might intercept 7 or 8. That leaves 2 or 3 getting through. When those missiles potentially carry nuclear warheads, a 70% or 80% success rate isn't acceptable. This vulnerability has driven Japanese defense thinking toward a stark conclusion. The only reliable way to prevent North Korean nuclear strikes on Japan is to destroy North Korean missiles before they launch. The political evolution toward this position has been gradual but accelerating. In 2022, Japan announced plans to acquire Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States, marking the first time Japan would possess weapons capable of striking targets deep in North Korea. In 2024, Japanese defense white papers began explicitly discussing counterstrike capabilities, using carefully chosen language to distinguish between offensive warfighting and defensive preemption. Japanese defense spending increased from 1% of GDP, the historical ceiling, to 2% by 2025. New capabilities were fielded: extended-range air-to-surface missiles, improved satellite reconnaissance, cyber warfare units, and special operations forces trained for missions beyond Japanese territory. Let's analyze what Tokyo's response tells us about where this is heading. Within 90 minutes of the missile impact, the Japanese Prime Minister convened the National Security Council. The speed of the policy response suggests pre-existing planning. This wasn't improvised. Japanese defense planners had gamed out scenarios exactly like this and prepared response options. The statement issued by the Prime Minister's office was carefully calibrated. It didn't declare war. It didn't announce immediate strikes. But it established a new red line. Japan reserves the right to conduct preemptive strikes against imminent threats to Japanese territory. The legal framework for this position rests on reinterpretation of Article 9 and international law's concept of anticipatory self-defense. Under international law, nations can use force in self-defense not only after an armed attack occurs, but also when an attack is imminent and no alternative means are available to prevent it. Japan is arguing that North Korean missiles on launch pads, fueled and ready to fire, constitute an imminent threat that justifies preemptive action. This interpretation is controversial. Critics argue it violates the spirit of Japan's peace constitution. Supporters counter that the Constitution allows self-defense, and effective self-defense in the missile age requires the ability to strike enemy launch platforms. The military capabilities required for this mission are substantial, and Japan is now moving to acquire them. Preemptive strikes against North Korean missile sites require several components. First, intelligence, real-time surveillance of North Korean missile facilities to detect launch preparations. Japan is upgrading its intelligence satellite constellation and deepening intelligence sharing with the United States and South Korea. Second, precision strike weapons, missiles or aircraft capable of reaching targets 800 to 1,200 kilometers away with minimal warning. Japan is acquiring AGM-158 JSSM cruise missiles with ranges exceeding 900 kilometers and is discussing purchases of longer-range variants. Third, stealth penetration capability. North Korean air defenses, while not world-class, are sufficient to threaten conventional strike aircraft. Japan is accelerating F-35 purchases and exploring whether F-35s could carry out initial suppression missions. Fourth, cyber and electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt North Korean command and control during the critical minutes between strike initiation and missile launch. The operational challenge is daunting. North Korean missile forces are designed for survivability. Mobile launchers can hide in tunnels, disperse across the countryside, and move to launch positions with little warning. Hitting these systems requires exquisite intelligence and extremely rapid strike timelines. Even if Japan develops perfect intelligence and acquires ideal weapons, there's no guarantee of successfully preventing a North Korean launch. Pyongyang could simply launch on warning, firing missiles the moment it detects Japanese strike preparations. This creates a use-it-or-lose-it dynamic that increases crisis instability. Now let's examine the American response, which has been notably cautious. The United States publicly supports Japan's right to self-defense and has reaffirmed the security treaty. But privately, American officials are deeply concerned. A Japanese preemptive strike capability creates risks the United States would rather avoid. If Japan strikes North Korea preemptively, North Korea might retaliate not just against Japan, but against U.S. bases in Japan, against South Korea, or even against the U.S. mainland with ICBMs. This could drag the United States into a war that American leaders didn't choose to start. Washington's preference has always been to maintain escalation control. Japanese strike capabilities transfer some of that control to Tokyo. There's also the China factor, which we need to examine in detail because Beijing's calculations drive much of regional security. China has historically opposed North Korean provocations, but has also opposed robust Japanese remilitarization. From Beijing's perspective, Japan's move toward preemptive strike doctrine is more threatening than North Korea's missile programs. Why? Because capabilities developed to strike North Korea could also strike China. A Japanese military equipped with long-range cruise missiles, stealth aircraft, improved ISR, and offensive cyber capabilities isn't just a threat to Pyongyang. It's a potential threat to Chinese military installations, Taiwan Strait operations, and South China Sea positions. Chinese state media response to Japan's policy shift has been predictably harsh, warning that Japan is abandoning its peace constitution and returning to militarism. But the more significant Chinese response is operational. Since the Hokkaido incident, Chinese military flights near Japanese airspace have increased. Chinese naval vessels are conducting more frequent patrols in waters adjacent to Japanese territory. This isn't preparation for war. It's signaling. Beijing is reminding Tokyo that Japanese military expansion will be met with Chinese military expansion. It's a security dilemma spiral. Japan builds capabilities to defend against North Korea. China perceives these capabilities as threatening. China builds counter capabilities. Japan perceives these as threatening and builds more capabilities. Each side's actions, intended as defensive, appear offensive to the other side. South Korea's position is particularly complex and often misunderstood. Seoul faces the same North Korean threat as Japan, arguably more acutely since North Korea possesses thousands of artillery pieces that can hit the South Korean capital within minutes. You might expect South Korea to welcome Japanese capabilities that could help suppress North Korean missiles. But South Korean public opinion is deeply ambivalent about Japanese military expansion. Historical memories of Japanese colonization of Korea remain strong. South Korean political leaders must balance threat perception of North Korea against public suspicion of Japan. The current South Korean government has taken a pragmatic approach, supporting enhanced Japan-South Korea-U.S. trilateral security cooperation while carefully avoiding public endorsement of Japanese preemptive strike doctrine. The nuclear question looms over all of this. If Japan is considering preemptive strikes against North Korean missile sites, is Japan also considering preemptive strikes against North Korean nuclear facilities? This is where the strategic risk becomes extreme. North Korea's nuclear weapon sites are hardened, buried, and dispersed. Destroying them would require sustained air campaigns or potentially tactical nuclear weapons to penetrate underground facilities. Japan doesn't possess nuclear weapons and has no announced intention to acquire them. But the logic of preemption against North Korean missiles leads inexorably toward the question of preemption against North Korean nuclear capability. If you're willing to strike missiles on launch pads, why wouldn't you strike nuclear weapons before they're mounted on those missiles? This is the nightmare scenario that keeps American, Chinese, and Russian strategists awake at night. A Japanese conventional preemptive strike that North Korea interprets as an attempt to destroy its nuclear deterrent, leading Pyongyang to launch nuclear weapons in a use them or lose them panic. The risk of miscalculation in such a scenario is catastrophic. Even if Japan's intentions are limited, North Korea's perception of threat could trigger nuclear use. Once one nuclear weapon is used, the probability of wider nuclear exchange increases dramatically. Let's talk about the Kim regime's calculations, because Pyongyang's response to Japan's policy shift will determine whether this crisis escalates or stabilizes. North Korea has historically relied on its missiles and nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee of regime survival. Pyongyang learned from the fate of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi that leaders who give up weapons of mass destruction can be toppled by external intervention. North Korea's nuclear program isn't primarily about conquering South Korea or attacking Japan. It's about ensuring that no external power can execute regime change in Pyongyang without paying an unacceptable price. But Japan's new preemptive strike posture threatens this calculus. If Japanese forces can destroy North Korean missiles before they launch, North Korea's deterrent credibility collapses. Pyongyang's likely response is to double down on survivability measures and to increase the number of missiles to make preemption more difficult. We should expect North Korea to build more mobile launchers, expand tunnel complexes, improve concealment measures, and potentially disperse nuclear warheads more widely. We might also see North Korea lower the threshold for nuclear use, moving toward a launch-on-warning doctrine where missiles would fire automatically on detection of incoming strikes. This would maximize deterrent credibility, but also maximize the risk of accidental or miscalculated nuclear war. The economic dimensions of this crisis deserve attention. Japan is committing to massive defense spending increases to acquire preemptive strike capabilities. The 2026 defense budget requests include $8 billion for long-range strike systems alone. This is in addition to ongoing modernization programs for submarines, surface combatants, fighter aircraft, and missile defense. Japan's economy can afford this spending, but it represents a significant reallocation of resources. Money spent on defense is money not spent on social programs, infrastructure, or debt reduction. Japanese public support for defense spending is high now, in the immediate aftermath of the Hokkaido incident, but sustaining this support over years will require continued perception of threat. North Korea, by contrast, is operating from a position of economic weakness. The country's economy is stagnant. International sanctions limit access to technology and materials needed for military modernization. North Korea's missile and nuclear programs consume resources that could otherwise address desperate humanitarian needs. But the Kim regime's survival depends on maintaining military capability, so economic constraints won't stop weapons development. They'll just make it slower and less sophisticated. This asymmetry creates an arms race that Japan can win economically, but that North Korea cannot afford to abandon politically. Now we need to address the domestic political dynamics within Japan, because the shift toward preemptive strike doctrine isn't universally supported. Japanese politics includes a significant pacifist movement that views any expansion of military capability as betraying the principles that have kept Japan at peace since 1945. These voices argue that preemptive strike capability makes war more likely, not less likely, by creating pressure to use such capabilities in a crisis. They warn that Japan is heading down a path that ends in militarization and potential conflict with China. These concerns are not fringe positions. They're held by significant portions of the Japanese electorate, particularly among older citizens who remember the post-war Reconstruction period. However, the political center of gravity in Japan has shifted. Younger generations who didn't experience World War II are less emotionally attached to strict pacifism and more pragmatically focused on security in a dangerous neighborhood. North Korean missile tests, Chinese military expansion, and perceived declining American commitment to Asian security have all contributed to this shift. The Hokkaido incident accelerated a trend that was already underway. Public opinion polling after the missile impact showed overwhelming support for enhanced defense capabilities. Politicians across the spectrum, except for the far left, now support some version of counterstrike or preemptive capability. The debate is no longer whether Japan should have these capabilities, but rather how extensively they should be developed and under what circumstances they would be used. The alliance management challenges are subtle but important. The United States wants Japan to be a strong ally, capable of defending itself and contributing to regional security. But the United States also wants to maintain control over escalation in any conflict with North Korea. If Japan possesses independent strike capabilities and the political will to use them, American control over crisis escalation diminishes. Washington would prefer a model where Japan has the capabilities but coordinates closely with the United States before any use. Tokyo, increasingly aware of its vulnerability, wants to retain the option to act independently if American response isn't sufficiently rapid or robust. This tension between Allied coordination and national sovereignty is manageable in peacetime but could become critical in the next North Korean crisis. But we have to acknowledge the serious uncertainties and potential problems with Japan's new approach. First, there's the targeting problem. North Korean mobile missiles are designed to be hard to find and even harder to hit. North Korea operates in a denied environment with minimal electromagnetic emissions that could betray locations. Intelligence collection is extremely difficult. Satellites can provide some coverage, but North Korea has hundreds of tunnels and underground facilities. Even with perfect intelligence, the strike timeline is compressed. From detection of launch preparation to actual launch could be less than 30 minutes. Can Japanese strike systems respond that quickly? If not, the preemptive strike capability is more theoretical than practical. Second, there's the escalation risk. A Japanese preemptive strike, even if successful against missiles, could trigger North Korean retaliation through other means: cyber attacks on Japanese infrastructure, special operations attacks, or artillery strikes on South Korea to punish the alliance. North Korea might calculate that regional chaos serves its interests by demonstrating that conflict is too costly for Japan and the United States to sustain. This escalation could lead to outcomes worse than the original threat. Third, there's the verification problem. How does Japan know when a North Korean missile launch is imminent? Intelligence is rarely perfect. What if Japan misinterprets North Korean exercises or routine maintenance as launch preparation and strikes preemptively? A strike based on false intelligence would be catastrophic politically and strategically. It would undermine Japanese credibility, potentially fracture the U.S. alliance, and give North Korea legitimacy as a victim of aggression. Fourth, there's the alternative approaches question. Japan could invest the same resources in improved missile defenses, potentially achieving better protection at lower strategic risk. Advanced interceptors, directed energy weapons, and electronic warfare systems might provide defense without the escalatory risks of preemptive strikes. Some strategic analysts argue that Japan is choosing the more aggressive path when less risky alternatives exist. These alternatives deserve serious consideration before Japan commits fully to a preemptive strike doctrine. So where does this leave Northeast Asia's security environment? The Hokkaido incident has triggered a fundamental reassessment of deterrence and defense in one of the world's most dangerous regions. Japan's move toward preemptive strike capability represents a rational response to a real threat, but it also introduces new instabilities into a regional balance that was already fragile. If Japan successfully develops and deploys preemptive strike capabilities, it achieves a degree of strategic autonomy it hasn't possessed in 77 years. This could strengthen deterrence against North Korea by convincing Pyongyang that missile launches carry unacceptable risk. It could also reassure the Japanese public that their government can protect them without total reliance on American intervention. These are real benefits, but the risks are equally real. A more militarily capable and assertive Japan changes China's strategic calculations in ways that could lead to intensified military competition. The potential for miscalculation in a crisis increases when both sides possess offensive capabilities and short decision timelines. The risk of a limited conflict escalating to nuclear use, while still low in absolute terms, is higher than it has been in decades. The next critical period is the next 12 to 24 months. Japan will move forward with capability development, weapons acquisitions, and operational planning. North Korea will respond with its own measures to enhance survivability and maintain deterrence. China will adjust its military posture based on perceived Japanese threat. The United States will attempt to manage alliance relations while maintaining regional stability. Any one of these processes could generate crises. The fundamental problem is that there are no good options. Japan cannot accept permanent vulnerability to North Korean nuclear blackmail. But Japan's attempt to escape that vulnerability creates new risks for everyone in the region. North Korea cannot abandon its nuclear and missile programs because regime survival depends on them. But continuing those programs drives Japanese countermeasures that erode North Korean deterrence. China cannot tolerate a heavily armed Japan without responding militarily. But Chinese responses drive further Japanese military expansion. It's a classic security dilemma, where each actor's rational pursuit of security makes everyone less secure. This is the new reality in Northeast Asia. The age of pure Japanese pacifism ended when North Korean debris hit Hokkaido. What comes next depends on choices made in Tokyo, Pyongyang, Washington, Beijing, and Seoul over the coming months. Those choices will determine whether we're witnessing a necessary adaptation to change threats, or the beginning of a regional arms race that ends in catastrophe. We'll be tracking every development as this situation evolves. This is exactly the kind of strategic shift that determines whether regions remain stable or slide toward conflict. The weapons being developed now, the doctrines being written now, the political decisions being made now will shape Asian security for the next generation. That's why you need to understand this. That's why this matters. And that's why you should subscribe to States News, because we'll keep you informed on the military and geopolitical developments that reshape our world.